He wasn't anyone's first choice, but he was God's. What if I told you that the greatest king in Israel's history wasn't born in a palace, but in a forgotten field? That when the prophet Samuel arrived to anoint the next ruler of God's people, David's own father didn't even bother to invite him. That when Israel needed a warrior, they ignored the boy with a sling. That when God looked for a leader, he didn't choose a man sitting on a throne. He chose a shepherd tending sheep. This is the story of a boy who went from a nobody to a giant slayer, from a runaway fugitive to a king, from a man after God's own heart to a ruler whose greatest enemy wasn't a Philistine warrior, but his own failures. His story is one of faith, betrayal, war, love, power, and redemption. And if you've ever felt like you were overlooked, underestimated, or unqualified, then stay with me, because David's journey is proof that God calls the unexpected. We put timestamps in the description so you can jump to the sections that interest you most. And if this Deep Bible Stories video gives you a new perspective, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. We've also converted our most popular videos into ebooks. Check the link in the description. If you'd like this video in ebook format, let us know in the comments. Now let's go back to where it all began. Before the throne, before the battles, before history knew his name. Let's meet David, the king no one saw coming. David's story doesn't begin with royal trumpets or a grand prophecy of greatness. It begins in a place no one was looking, on the outskirts of Bethlehem, in the quiet fields where sheep grazed under the open sky. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, the one who never got invited to the important meetings. When people spoke of Israel's future, they spoke of warriors, kings, and leaders. David's name never came up. He wasn't the oldest, the strongest, or the most experienced. He was the kid they sent out to watch the sheep while real men handled real matters. But God had been watching him all along. It was an ordinary day in Bethlehem when the great prophet Samuel arrived. He came with a mission straight from God himself, to anoint the next king of Israel. The people of the town trembled at his arrival. Samuel didn't show up for small matters. Was it a warning, a judgment? But Jesse, David's father, had no idea that this visit was about to change the course of history. Samuel commanded Jesse to bring his sons forward. One of them was destined to be king. First came Eliab, tall, strong, and commanding. If ever there was a kingly figure, this was it. Even Samuel himself thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. But God's voice stopped him. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel. 7 sons, 7 rejections. Confusion filled the room. Had God made a mistake? Are these all your sons? Samuel asked, and Jesse hesitated. There is still the youngest, he admitted, but he's tending the sheep. David wasn't even invited. Think about that. His own father didn't consider him worthy to stand among his brothers. No one thought he mattered. No one saw potential in him. No one thought he was even an option. But God did. Samuel ordered them to bring David immediately. No one would sit until he arrived. And when David finally entered the house covered in dust, smelling of the field, just a young boy with no title, no armor, no reputation, the voice of God thundered in Samuel's heart. Rise and anoint him. This is the one. 1 Samuel 16:12. David, the forgotten shepherd, the future king. David wasn't the strongest. He wasn't trained in battle. He wasn't politically connected. But he had something no one else had, a heart that chased after God. Long before Samuel arrived, David had been in the fields learning how to lead. When a lion came for his sheep, he didn't run, he fought. When a bear tried to steal from his flock, he risked his life to stop it. No one was watching, no one was keeping score, but David was already a king in training. Not in the way men expected, but in the way God required. He who is faithful with little will be faithful with much. Luke 16:10. God didn't send David straight to the throne. He sent him back to the fields. Think about that. The young man who had just been anointed as the next king of Israel was sent back to tend sheep. No royal robes, no crown, just the same lonely, hidden life he had before. Why? Because greatness isn't built in palaces, it's forged in the unseen moments. David spent his days playing the harp, writing psalms, and protecting his flock. He talked to God when no one was around. He trusted God in the silence. And this is where many people give up. What do you do when God calls you to something greater, but then sends you back to the same place? David could have complained. David could have doubted. David could have walked away. But instead, he did what he had always done. He remained faithful. And without even realizing it, he was being prepared. His battles with wild animals were training him to fight giants. His long nights in the wilderness were teaching him to lead with courage. His deep prayers and psalms were forming him into a king who would worship. God was molding him in the unseen places, and soon the world would see what God had always known. The shepherd boy forgotten by men was the king handpicked by God. How many of us feel overlooked? Like David, we watch others be chosen while we're left behind. We see others step into their calling while we wait in silence. But God sees what no one else sees. Maybe you're in a season of preparation. Maybe you're fighting battles no one notices. Maybe you're wondering if you'll ever step into the destiny God promised. David's story is proof that God doesn't forget his anointed. If he called you, he will raise you up at the right time. The world may overlook you, but God never will. And soon the shepherd boy would come face to face with a giant that no warrior dared to challenge. Would you have the faith to face a Goliath? Next, we step into one of the greatest moments in history. David versus Goliath, the battle that changed everything. The battle with Goliath, the moment that changed everything. The battlefield was silent. For 40 days, an enormous figure had stepped forward from the enemy's camp and uttered the same chilling challenge. Why do you even bother lining up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man to fight me. If he kills me, we will be your slaves, but if I kill him, you will be ours. No one moved, no one spoke. The armies of Israel, God's chosen people, stood frozen in fear. And no one was more terrified than King Saul himself, the mighty warrior king, the one Israel had begged for, the man who stood head and shoulders above everyone else, should have been the first to step up. But Saul knew this battle was unwinnable, because Goliath wasn't just any warrior. He was a monster, 9 feet tall, armor like iron plating, a spear heavier than a grown man. Goliath was a walking fortress, an executioner in human form. Every morning he marched onto the battlefield, his voice thundering like a war drum. Every day the warriors of Israel shrank back in terror. The mighty men of Saul, men who had faced wars before, trembled like children. And worst of all, Goliath mocked God. Your God is weak. Your armies are nothing. Bring me a real fight. And no one stepped forward until one day the shepherd boy arrived. David wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't a soldier. He had no armor, no sword, no rank. He was just delivering food to his brothers, running an errand for his father. But when he heard Goliath's challenge, something inside him burned with rage. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? 1 Samuel 17:26. The soldiers scoffed. Have you seen him? He will crush you. His own brothers sneered. Go back to your sheep, David. This is a war, not a game. But David saw something no one else did. They saw a giant too big to fight. David saw a giant too big to miss. The king's doubt. Saul tries to stop David. Word spread quickly through the camp. There's a boy who says he'll fight Goliath. Saul laughed when he saw him. You are only a boy. He has been a warrior since his youth. But David's eyes were fierce. I have fought lions. I have fought bears. When they tried to steal my sheep, I struck them down. And the same God who delivered me from them will deliver me from this Philistine. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't bluffing. David had spent his whole life trusting God in private. Now God was about to make his faith public. Saul tried to weigh David down with his own royal armor. The metal was too heavy. The sword was too big. David took it off. I don't need this. He didn't need man's protection. He only needed God's. And so David walked onto the battlefield dressed as a shepherd. No armor, no sword, just a sling, a few stones, and unshakable faith. Goliath laughed when he saw him. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? He roared. David didn't flinch. He stood his ground. Then he spoke. You come against me with a sword, a spear and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. The battlefield fell silent. Then Goliath charged. His massive footsteps shook the ground. His spear was raised to kill. And David ran toward him, not away, not hesitating, straight toward the giant. With a single practiced motion, he reached into his pouch, pulled out a stone, and let it fly. Whiz! The rock sliced through the air. Crack! It struck Goliath's forehead. The giant staggered. The mighty warrior, the undefeatable champion, fell face first, dead. One stone, one moment, one boy's faith, and everything changed. The Philistine army froze in shock, and the Israelites exploded in shouts. Their fear turned to fire as they rushed forward, chasing the Philistines all the way back to their cities. One battle changed Israel's future. One boy's courage shattered an empire's grip. And that's the power of faith. David's story isn't just history. It's a blueprint for every battle we face, because we all have giants, fear, doubt, addiction, failure, sin. And like Israel, we often freeze in fear. We think this is too big, this is impossible. But David's story reminds us nothing is impossible with God. David didn't win because he was the strongest. He didn't win because he was the most trained. He won because he believed, and the same God who guided his stone can guide yours. What Goliath are you facing today? Because if God was faithful then, he is faithful now. This wasn't just David's victory, it was only the beginning. From here, David would rise in fame and become a target for King Saul's jealousy. The hunted shepherd was about to become a fugitive. Next, the fugitive king, when David became public enemy number one. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Women danced in the streets, tambourines shaking in celebration. Children ran alongside soldiers, chanting the words that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. What had begun as a song of victory was about to become a death sentence. Saul, the mighty king of Israel, had returned from battle expecting praise. Instead, the people had turned their eyes to another. A young warrior, a shepherd, a boy with no royal blood, but a heart that God had chosen. David. Saul's cheerful smile faded into a scowl. His celebration turned to suspicion. His pride turned to poison. And that was the moment the king of Israel made a decision that would define the rest of his life. David must die. Days before, David had been an unknown shepherd. Now he was the most famous man in Israel. After slaying Goliath, Saul had brought David into his palace, rewarding him with riches, status, and a position as a commander in the army. And David excelled. Every battle he fought, he won. Every mission he was given, he completed. Everywhere he went, God was with him. The people saw it. They adored him, and they sang his name in the streets. And with every victory, Saul grew smaller, and David grew greater. At first, Saul tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself, David is just a soldier, just another man in my kingdom. But those words kept repeating in his head. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. The paranoia took root. What more can he take from me? The only thing left is the throne itself. And the moment that should have made Saul a mentor turned him into a murderer. One evening, David was playing his harp in the palace, the sweet sound filling the halls. The music should have soothed Saul's spirit. Instead, his rage boiled over. Without a word, he grabbed a spear from beside his throne. David's fingers moved across the strings, unaware of the danger behind him. Then, whoosh! The spear flew across the room, aimed straight at David's heart. Thunk! It buried itself deep into the wall. David leapt to his feet, breathing hard, staring at the weapon that had nearly taken his life. He turned to see Saul, chest heaving, eyes burning with hatred. "I will pin him to the wall," the king muttered. David didn't wait for a second chance. He ran. Saul was determined. If he couldn't kill David himself, he would let the Philistines do it. So he sent David on the most dangerous missions, hoping he would never return. But David kept coming back victorious, unscathed, praised even more by the people. Desperate, Saul came up with another plan. Marry my daughter. It seemed like an honor, but it was a trap. To earn her hand, David had to kill 100 Philistines, an impossible mission. But David killed 200. He was now Saul's son-in-law, but instead of bringing Saul peace, it drove him further into madness. David wasn't just a soldier now, he was family. And Saul knew David wasn't just a threat, David was his replacement. There was one person in the kingdom who didn't see David as a rival, Jonathan, Saul's own son. By all logic, Jonathan should have been David's enemy. Jonathan was the heir to the throne. David was the rising star. Yet instead of resenting David, Jonathan loved him like a brother. He saw God's hand on David's life. And when Saul commanded his son to kill David, Jonathan risked everything to warn him. "Run, David. My father will never stop hunting you." And so David, once a hero, once a commander, once a son-in-law of the king, became a fugitive. For years, David lived like an outlaw. He hid in caves, traveled from city to city, and escaped ambush after ambush. The once great warrior was sleeping in the wilderness, eating whatever he could find, surrounded by criminals and outcasts. There were nights he questioned everything. "God, you anointed me, but now I'm hunted like an animal. Where are you?" Yet even in the darkest places, God never left him. David gathered a loyal band of warriors, men who would fight for him no matter what. He had no palace, no crown, no army. But God was with him. And then came the test. One night Saul was hunting David with 3,000 men. Exhausted, the king entered a cave to rest, unaware that David was already inside. This was it. David's men whispered, "God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Kill him now." David crept forward, dagger in hand. Saul was helpless, unarmed, exposed. With one strike, David could end it all. He could take the throne, take his revenge, fulfill the prophecy. But instead, David cut off a piece of Saul's robe. And when Saul left the cave, David held it up and shouted, "My lord the king, I could have killed you, but I will not touch the Lord's anointed." Saul broke down in tears. "You are more righteous than I am, David." But his jealousy never faded. The hunt continued, and David remained a king without a kingdom. As Saul spiraled deeper into madness, the Philistines grew stronger. The king who had once hunted David was now the one being hunted. The battle came. The Philistines overran Israel's army. Jonathan, David's closest friend, was killed. And on the battlefield, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by God, Saul fell on his own sword. The mighty king of Israel was dead, and far away in the wilderness, David received the news. He didn't celebrate, he wept. How the mighty have fallen, he cried, because even though Saul had tried to kill him for years, David never lost his honor. And now the man who had spent his life running was about to take the throne. Next, David the king, the rise to power. David stood in the shadows, his breath slow and measured, his fingers curled around the hilt of his dagger. This was it. Saul, the man who had hunted him like an animal, who had forced him into exile, who had taken everything from him, was lying just a few feet away, defenseless, unaware. David's men whispered in his ear, "This is your chance. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Strike him down." For years David had run. For years he had suffered, and now with one swift motion he could end it all, take the throne, take his revenge, fulfill the prophecy. But instead, David chose mercy, and that decision changed everything. Saul had become obsessed. Every day he thought about David, not as a loyal warrior, not as a son-in-law, not as a friend, but as a threat. His kingdom was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. So he gathered 3,000 of his best soldiers and scoured the wilderness, hunting David like a wild beast. One afternoon, the king rode through the barren hills of En-Gedi, sweat dripping from his brow. The search was exhausting, so when he spotted a cave in the rocks, he stepped inside to relieve himself, letting his guard down. What he didn't know was that David was already there. Hidden deep within the shadows, David and his men held their breath. Saul was completely alone. This was no battlefield, no army stood between them. David could strike and be king by nightfall. His men leaned in, urging him, "God has given him into your hands. This is the moment you've been waiting for." David crept forward, one step, another. He raised his dagger, but instead of plunging it into Saul's back, he cut off a piece of his robe. Saul left the cave unaware. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he heard a voice behind him. "My lord, the king!" Saul froze. He turned to see David standing at the mouth of the cave, holding up a piece of his robe. "I could have killed you," David declared, his voice shaking with emotion, "but I will not harm the Lord's anointed." The wind blew through the canyon, silent. The soldiers watched, waiting. Then for the first time in years, Saul's anger broke. His shoulders trembled. Tears streamed down his face. "You are more righteous than I," he admitted. "You have repaid me with good, while I have repaid you with evil." For a moment it seemed like the war between them was over, but Saul's heart did not change. And the hunt continued. Months passed. David remained on the run, sleeping in caves, moving from place to place, never staying too long. Then came another opportunity. Saul and his army were camped in the wilderness of Ziph, their tents stretched out under the moonlit sky. That night David and his men crept into the camp, past the first watchman, past the second, and there in the center of the camp Saul lay sleeping. His spear, the very weapon he had thrown at David in the palace, was stuck in the ground beside him. Once again, God had delivered Saul into his hands. Abishai, David's most fearless warrior, leaned close. "Let me strike him with his own spear," he whispered. "One blow, and this will all be over." David looked down at his enemy, the king who had tried to kill him, the king who had forced him into exile. The king who had stolen years of his life. Justice would be so easy, but David shook his head. "Do not touch the Lord's anointed." Instead, he took the spear and Saul's water jug, a sign, a symbol. And then, without a sound, he walked away. As the sun rose, David stood on a distant hill, calling out to Saul's army. "Abner," he shouted to the commander of Saul's guard, "you have failed your king. Where is his spear?" Saul awoke, rubbing his eyes, and then he saw it, David holding his spear. Once again David had spared his life. Once again David had proven himself the better man. Saul's voice broke as he called out, "I have sinned. Return to me, my son David. I will no longer seek your life." But David knew the truth. Saul could not be trusted. David turned his back and walked away, not as a servant, not as an outlaw, but as a man chosen by God. Twice David had the perfect opportunity. Twice he could have taken Saul's life and ended his suffering. But David understood something that Saul never did. Power is not something you take. It is something God gives. David refused to grasp for the throne. Instead, he waited for God's timing. Unlike Saul, who had clung to his crown with fear, David trusted that when the time was right, God would place him on the throne himself. And that is why David was a king after God's own heart. The story of Saul and David is a tale of two kings. One was chosen by the people, the other was chosen by God. One was insecure, desperate to hold on to power. The other was secure, willing to trust God's timing. One took matters into his own hands and lost everything. The other waited on the Lord and was given a kingdom. David passed the test of power. He proved that he would not become another Saul. And soon the throne that Saul had fought to keep would be given to David by divine right. But before that day came, Saul had one final battle to fight. If this video blessed you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget, we've converted our most popular videos into eBooks. Check the link in the description to grab your copy and let us know in the comments if you'd like this video in ebook format. The battlefield was drenched in blood. Arrows filled the sky like a swarm of locusts cutting through the air with terrifying precision. The Israelite army was in full retreat, their shields shattered, their swords broken, and on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, King Saul stood, his face pale, his armor dented, and his spirit already crushed. The once mighty ruler of Israel was about to fall. For years, Saul had clung to his throne in paranoia, chasing shadows, chasing David, chasing a future he could not hold on to. But the true enemy, the Philistines, had not been idle. They had grown stronger, more organized, more determined. And now, as Saul stood against them at Mount Gilboa, he realized something devastating. God was no longer with him. He had sought guidance, but God was silent. He had turned to the priests, but they had no answers. In a moment of sheer desperation, Saul had even consulted a witch, a forbidden act that sealed his fate. And now, as the Philistine war chariots thundered across the battlefield, he knew this was the end. The battle raged with unstoppable fury. Spears pierced flesh, swords clashed, and one by one Saul's sons were struck down. First Abinadab, then Malchishua, and finally Jonathan. Jonathan, the prince who had risked everything to protect David. Jonathan, the man who had once defeated an entire Philistine garrison with nothing but his faith and a sword. Jonathan, the friend who had loved David as his own soul. Now he lay motionless in the dirt, his blood soaking into the ground of Israel. Saul turned, staggering backward in horror. His kingdom was already lost, his lineage destroyed, his sons gone. And then came the arrow. It struck him with a sickening thud, piercing his armor, cutting into his flesh. The pain shot through him like fire. Saul fell to his knees, his vision blurring. He gasped, trying to rise, but his strength was leaving him. The Philistine archers closed in. If they caught him alive, they would torture him, mock him, humiliate him, parade him through their cities as a broken king. Saul couldn't bear the thought. With trembling hands, he turned to his armor-bearer and whispered, "Draw your sword and kill me, before these uncircumcised men come and abuse me." But the young soldier refused. He could not raise his weapon against the anointed king of Israel. Saul had no choice. With his last breath, he fell on his own sword, and just like that, the first king of Israel was no more. Far from the battlefield, David sat in the wilderness of Ziklag, unaware that the throne he had long been promised was now empty. Then came the messenger, his clothes torn, his face filled with urgency. "Saul is dead," the man gasped, "and so is Jonathan." David's heart stopped. Saul, his enemy, Jonathan, his best friend, both gone. For a moment there was silence, and then David wept, not with relief, not with victory, but with grief. This was not how he had imagined it. He had spent years running from Saul, being hunted like an animal. But now that Saul was dead, he felt no joy, only sorrow. He tore his garments, he fasted, and then he composed one of the most heartbreaking songs in the Bible, "How the Mighty Have Fallen." Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. "Jonathan, my brother, your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." It was a funeral song, not a victory cry, because David did not rejoice in the death of his enemy. He mourned. Saul was dead. But David's journey to the throne was not over. Instead of taking his place as king of all Israel, he was first crowned only over Judah, his own tribe. Why? Because Saul's family still clung to power. Abner, Saul's former general, took Saul's last surviving son, Ishbosheth, and made him king over the northern tribes of Israel. For 7 long years, Israel was divided. David ruled in Hebron, Ishbosheth ruled in Mahanaim, and a brutal civil war broke out. It was brother against brother, the house of Saul against the house of David, bloodshed, betrayal. But slowly the balance shifted. David's forces grew stronger, Ishbosheth's power crumbled. And then came the final blow. Ishbosheth was a weak king, a shadow of his father, and when his own commanders saw that David was winning, they turned on him. One night 2 of his own officers crept into his chambers and murdered him in his sleep. Then they ran to David expecting a reward, but instead of honoring them, David was furious. "You killed an innocent man in his bed." And just as he had done with the Amalekite who falsely claimed to have killed Saul, David ordered their execution. With Ishbosheth dead, the civil war was over. And the leaders of Israel finally came to David, bowing before him, saying, "We are your flesh and blood. Rule over us." And so in the city of Hebron, David was crowned king over all Israel. At last, after decades of struggle, betrayal, and exile. The shepherd boy had become the king, but David's story was far from over, because his greatest victories and his greatest failures were still ahead. David did not seize power, he did not force his way to the throne. Unlike Saul, he did not cling to his kingdom out of fear. David waited on God, and when the time was right, the throne was given to him, not by conquest, but by divine appointment. But would David rule wisely, or would the temptations of power lead him down the same path as Saul? His reign had begun, but the trials of power, war, and sin were only just beginning. Next, David's golden age, the king who conquered giants and kingdoms. The sound of war drums had faded. For 7 years, Israel had been torn in two, divided by allegiances, by vengeance, by the ghosts of Saul's legacy. But now the war was over, and all eyes turned toward one man, David, the shepherd-turned-king, the warrior who had never lost a battle, the man who had waited patiently for God's promise to be fulfilled. Now the nation stood at a crossroads. Would David truly unite the people, or would he, like Saul before him, fall victim to pride, paranoia, and fear? The answer would change Israel's history forever. With Ishbosheth dead, the remaining leaders of the northern tribes were left in disarray. For years they had resisted David, refusing to acknowledge his right to the throne. But now their supposed king was gone, betrayed by his own men. There was no one left to lead them, and so, one by one, the elders of Israel's remaining tribes made their way to Hebron, where David ruled over Judah. Dressed in mourning robes, they knelt before him and spoke the words that would change everything. We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, even while Saul was king, you led Israel in battle. The Lord has said, you shall shepherd his people and become their ruler." And with those words, the kingdom of Israel was reborn, not divided, not warring against itself, but one. For the first time since the days of Joshua, the people of Israel were truly united under one leader. And that leader was David. At 37 years old, David was crowned king over all of Israel. But he was not just another king. He was the first to rule over a united kingdom, the greatest ruler Israel had ever seen. And this was just the beginning. David had the throne, but now he needed a capital, a center of power that could bring all 12 tribes together, not just Judah, not just the north, but everyone. And David had the perfect place in mind, a city that had been overlooked for centuries, a city that sat right in the middle of the northern and southern tribes, making it the perfect neutral ground. A city that was so well fortified, no one had ever been able to conquer it. Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem was still under the control of the Jebusites, a Canaanite people who had held the city for generations. They were so confident in their impenetrable walls that when David's army arrived, they mocked him from the ramparts. "Even the blind and the lame can keep you out, David." But David laughed, because he knew something they didn't. His men had found a way in. Through a water tunnel, his soldiers infiltrated the city, opened the gates from the inside, and in a single sweeping victory, Jerusalem fell. David took the fortress, named it the City of David, and declared it the new capital of Israel. And this was not just a political move, it was a spiritual one. Jerusalem was not only a stronghold, it would become the dwelling place of God himself. But before that could happen, something sacred had to return. For years, the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence, had been in exile. It had been captured by the Philistines, moved from place to place, and finally left in the house of Abinadab, gathering dust. David knew, if Israel was truly to be united, they needed more than just a king. They needed God's presence restored to the heart of the nation. And so David ordered the Ark of the Covenant to be brought to Jerusalem. This was not just a ceremonial event. This was a moment that would define his reign, a day of rejoicing. The Ark, the very throne of God, was coming home. David and his men danced before the Ark, celebrating with music, trumpets, and sacrifices. The people sang. The nation rejoiced, and David danced like a man with no worries, like a man who had been pursued, hunted, and exiled, and now stood as king of a united people. But not everyone was impressed. As he leapt and spun before the ark, his wife Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched from the palace window. Her face twisted in disgust. To her, David looked foolish, a king behaving like a commoner, embarrassing himself in front of his subjects. When he returned home, she mocked him. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, dancing half naked like a fool in front of his servants. David did not care. "I will become even more undignified than this," he replied. "I will celebrate before the Lord." And from that day forward, Michal never bore children, a sign that the legacy of Saul would never continue through her. With the kingdom united, Jerusalem secured, and the Ark of God placed in the capital, Israel entered its greatest era, the Golden Age. For the first time in history, Israel was not at war with itself. David expanded the borders, brought justice to the people, and established a kingdom that would be remembered for centuries. The city of David had become the heart of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant had returned. The nation was at peace, and David, the shepherd boy who was once forgotten, was now the greatest king Israel had ever known. But peace never lasts forever, because David's greatest test was not with Goliath, not with Saul, not with the Philistines. His greatest battle was with himself, and the sins that followed would shake his kingdom to its core. Next, David and Bathsheba, the sin that changed everything. The sound of swords clashing, the thunder of war horses charging into battle, the roar of victory echoing across the land. This was the age of conquest, and at its center stood one man. David, the shepherd boy, had become a warrior king, a leader who had never known defeat. With every battle his kingdom grew, until Israel stood as the strongest nation in the region. But how did David do it? How did he take a divided, war-torn people and build an empire greater than Saul's? How did he go from a fugitive hiding in caves to a king whose name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies? The answer lies in his strategy, his warriors, and his unshakable trust in God. And this is how he did it. For most of Israel's history, the nation had been on the defensive. The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, Israel had spent generations fighting just to survive. Saul had led many battles, but his reign ended in disaster, with the Philistines shattering his army and his own men turning against him. But when David took the throne, everything changed. For the first time in history, Israel was not just fighting to survive. It was taking ground. David knew that if he didn't expand Israel's borders, the surrounding nations would see it as weak. And so, instead of waiting for war to come to him, David brought war to them. With the might of Israel's warriors behind him, he launched a series of military campaigns that would expand Israel's borders farther than ever before. The Philistines had tormented Israel for centuries. From the days of Samson to the reign of Saul, they had been Israel's greatest threat, pillaging cities, enslaving people, and crushing armies. Even when David killed Goliath, the Philistines did not disappear. But David was not Saul. He would not allow his people to live in fear. He led his armies to war, not just to fight back, but to crush the Philistine strongholds once and for all. One by one, their cities fell. Gath, Ekron, Ashdod, the once mighty Philistine empire crumbled under David's onslaught, never to rise again as a dominant force. For the first time in generations, Israel was no longer oppressed. The Philistines, the great enemy of Israel, had been subdued, and David was just getting started. David turned his attention to Moab. At first, the Moabites had shown him kindness, offering his family protection while he fled from Saul. But something had changed. Perhaps they had grown too comfortable in their power. Perhaps they had broken an alliance with David, or perhaps David saw their strength as a future threat. Either way, when David's army came upon Moab, he did something that shocked the ancient world. The Moabite warriors were lined up before him. He measured them with a cord. 2/3 of them were executed, while only 1/3 were spared and made into servants of Israel. It was a warning to every other nation. You defied David, and your kingdom will fall. David didn't just look west, he looked north. The Arameans of Damascus were powerful, but David's army defeated them and made them pay tribute to Israel. He looked south. The Edomites, longtime enemies of Israel, were defeated in battle, and their land was placed under Israel's control. Everywhere David went, he won. And with every victory, Israel's influence grew. No longer was Israel just a small kingdom in the hills. Now it was a superpower, a nation feared and respected across the region. But how? How did David win every battle? The answer lay in his warriors. David was not just a great warrior, he had great warriors beside him, a group of elite fighters known as David's mighty men. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were giants of war. Each one had stories of impossible feats, victories that defied logic. Bathsheba killed 800 men in a single battle with his spear. Eleazar fought so long his hand froze to his sword, and he alone defeated the enemy while Israel's army fled. Shammah stood his ground alone against the Philistines in a field when everyone else ran. And then there was Benaiah, the man who killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day, who defeated an Egyptian warrior twice his size. These men were David's elite force, the warriors who made Israel's army unstoppable. With them at his side, David's empire expanded beyond anything Israel had ever known. But it wasn't just about military strength. David's victories were not just the result of great warriors. They were the result of something greater. God was with him. Over and over, Scripture tells us one thing, and the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Yes, he was a brilliant strategist. Yes, he had mighty warriors. Yes, he trained harder than any king before him. But his true power was his trust in God. Before every battle, David prayed. Before every conquest, he asked God for guidance. And because he walked in obedience, God delivered his enemies into his hands. That's why David was never defeated, because his strength did not come from himself, it came from the Lord. At the height of David's reign, Israel's borders stretched farther than ever before. The kingdom was secure. The enemies of Israel were defeated. The land was prosperous. The people were at peace. David had done what no king before him had accomplished. He had taken a divided nation and built an empire. But victory has a price. David had spent years at war. He had conquered everything before him. But his greatest enemy was not on the battlefield. His greatest battle was yet to come, and it would not be fought with a sword, but with his own heart. The sword had never failed David. He had crushed armies. He had conquered cities. He had stood undefeated against the might of entire nations. But now, for the first time, David faced an enemy he could not fight with steel, an enemy that did not come from outside his kingdom, but from within himself, and this battle he would lose. This is the moment everything changed. This is the story of how Israel's greatest king fell, and it all started with a single look. Spring had come, the season of war. This was the time when kings led their armies into battle, expanding their borders and defending their lands. But this year, David did not go. He sent Joab, his general, to lead the troops. He sent his men to fight, but he stayed behind in Jerusalem. For the first time in his reign, David chose comfort over duty. And in that moment the cracks began to form, because idleness is the devil's playground. And that night, on his palace rooftop, David saw something that would change his life forever. She was bathing. The moonlight reflected off her skin. The water trickled down her back as she washed away the dust of the day. She was beautiful, and David could not look away. He had hundreds of wives. He had concubines, riches and power, but at that moment none of it mattered. He had to have her. David asked his servants about her, and they told him, "She is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." She was married not just to anyone, but to one of his most loyal warriors, a man who had fought beside him, who had bled for him, a man who was out in battle while David stayed home. David knew it was wrong. He knew what God had commanded, but power does something dangerous to the heart. When you can have anything you want, it's easy to believe the rules don't apply to you. And so David sent for her, and that night he took what wasn't his. Weeks passed. Then the news came. Bathsheba was pregnant. David felt a wave of panic. If the truth came out, his reputation would be ruined. The people would see him for what he had done. The anointed king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, an adulterer. And so David did what many powerful men do when they fall into sin. He tried to cover it up. He sent for Uriah. The warrior returned home from battle, summoned by the king himself. David greeted him as a friend, asked about the war, acted like nothing had happened. Then he gave Uriah a gift and said, "Go home to your wife, rest, enjoy your time away from battle." David hoped Uriah would sleep with Bathsheba. That way, no one would suspect the child wasn't his. But Uriah was a man of honor. He refused. "How can I enjoy the comfort of my home when my fellow soldiers are suffering on the battlefield?" Instead of going home, Uriah slept outside the palace gates. David's plan had failed, and now his heart grew darker. What started as lust turned into deception, and now deception would turn into murder. David wrote a letter, a sealed order. Inside it contained the sentence of death. David handed it to Uriah himself, the man who trusted him completely. And without knowing, Uriah carried his own execution orders back to the battlefield. The letter read, "Place Uriah at the front lines of the fiercest battle, then withdraw from him so that he is struck down and dies." Joab, David's general, read the orders, and he obeyed. Uriah was sent to the deadliest part of the war, and as David commanded, the soldiers pulled back. Uriah was left alone, surrounded. Spears pierced his flesh, swords cut him down, and just like that, David was a murderer. When news of Uriah's death reached David, he breathed a sigh of relief. The problem was gone. He took Bathsheba as his wife, and for a time he thought he had gotten away with it. But God had seen everything, and he would not be silent. One day the prophet Nathan came before David. He told a story. There were two men in a city. One was rich and had many sheep. The other was poor and had only one lamb, which he loved like a child. One day the rich man had a visitor. Instead of taking one of his own sheep to prepare a meal, he took the poor man's lamb, the only one he had, and killed it for himself. David's anger burned. "That man deserves to die," he shouted. Nathan turned to him, eyes filled with fire. "You are that man." David froze. In that instant he saw his sin laid bare. He had stolen another man's wife. He had murdered an innocent man. And now he would face the consequences. Nathan declared God's judgment. "The sword will never depart from your house." David repented. He fell to the ground and wept before God. But the damage had been done. The child Bathsheba carried would not live. David fasted. He begged. He pleaded with God for mercy. But on the seventh day the child died. And with that David saw the full weight of his choices. Sin always has consequences, no matter how powerful you are, no matter how much you try to cover it up. God sees everything, and he will not be mocked. David's life was forever changed. His family would be torn apart. His kingdom would suffer because of his failure. But in the midst of judgment, there was still mercy. David and Bathsheba would have another son, and this child would be named Solomon, the future king of Israel, the one who would build God's temple. A reminder that even when we fail, even when we fall into the deepest sin, God can still redeem. But the scars remain. David's worst days were still ahead, and the kingdom he built would soon begin to crumble. Next, the fall of David's house, the sins of his sons. Powerful armies had risen against David before. Philistine giants, Moabite raiders, the armies of Saul. But now, for the first time, the enemy was his own blood, his sons, his own household. David, the warrior king, the mighty ruler of Israel, would now become a fugitive once again. Not running from Saul, not hiding from foreign invaders, but fleeing from his own son. This is the tragedy of David's later years, a time when his greatest battles were not fought on the battlefield, but within his own home. And it all started with one horrific crime. David had many sons, but the oldest was Amnon. And as the firstborn, he was expected to be heir to the throne. But Amnon had a dark desire. His obsession was not with power or war, but with his own sister. Tamar, David's daughter, was beautiful, and Amnon wanted her. He burned with lust so intensely that he made himself sick over it. But she was out of his reach, untouchable. Until one day his cousin Jonadab, a master of manipulation, gave him a plan. "Pretend to be sick," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, ask him to send Tamar to care for you." David, unaware of Amnon's intentions, agreed. He sent Tamar to bring food and care for her sick brother. She came with kindness, with innocence, but when she entered his room, Amnon forced himself upon her, and when it was over, his desire turned to hatred. "Get out," he spat at her. Tamar, humiliated and weeping, pleaded, "Sending me away now is worse than what you've already done." But Amnon threw her out like she was nothing, and Tamar was never the same again. She tore her robes as she put ashes on her head, and she lived in shame in her brother's house for the rest of her life. But the most shocking part of the story, David did nothing. Tamar's full brother Absalom was furious. For 2 years he waited. 2 years he watched as Amnon went unpunished. 2 years he saw his father do nothing. But Absalom was not like David. He would not let injustice go unanswered. And so, one day he invited all of his brothers to a feast. Amnon came, unsuspecting, and when the time was right, Absalom gave the order. Amnon was struck down in cold blood. The heir to David's throne was dead, and Absalom fled. For 3 years he lived in exile, until David finally allowed him to return to Jerusalem. But even then, David refused to see his own son's face. The tension boiled beneath the surface, and soon Absalom would rise up against his father in the worst way imaginable. Absalom had everything a king needed. He was young, he was handsome, and the people loved him. For 4 years he worked behind the scenes. He positioned himself at the city gates where he would meet the people of Israel personally. He listened to their complaints, he won their hearts, and slowly he turned them against David, until one day Absalom made his move. In Hebron he declared himself king, and to David's horror the people followed him. The unthinkable had happened. David's own flesh and blood had stolen the throne. And the worst part, David had no choice but to flee. The king who had fought armies now ran from his own son, barefoot, weeping, hiding in the wilderness, just like he had when he was a young man running from Saul. History had repeated itself, but this time the pain was deeper, because this time the enemy was his own son. David could have fought back immediately. He could have killed Absalom and taken back his throne. But he gave a strange order to his generals: "Be gentle with the young man Absalom, for my sake." Despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the rebellion, despite the war, David still loved his son. But war doesn't wait for love, and in the heat of battle, Absalom's fate was sealed. Absalom was riding through the forest. His long flowing hair, his pride and glory, was caught in the branches of a great oak tree. His horse kept running, and Absalom was left hanging between heaven and earth. Vulnerable, helpless, Joab, David's ruthless general, ignored the king's orders. He took 3 spears and drove them into Absalom's heart, and the rebellion was over. The throne was David's once again. But when the news reached the king, David didn't celebrate and he didn't rejoice. He collapsed in grief. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" The cries of a father, not a king. And in that moment David realized the greatest pain a man can ever know is losing a son. David's later years were filled with sorrow. The consequences of his sins had destroyed his family. One son had raped his own sister. One son had murdered his brother. One son had stolen his throne, only to be killed in battle. And as David grew old, he must have wondered, was it all worth it? The kingdom was secure, but his family was broken, and soon David himself would fade from history, but his story would never be forgotten. If this video blessed you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget, we've converted our most popular videos into eBooks. Check the link in the description to grab your copy, and let us know in the comments if you'd like this video in ebook format. For decades, David had been a man after God's own heart. He had slain giants, conquered nations, and ruled over a united Israel. He had survived betrayals, family tragedies, and civil war. But his greatest mistake came when he least expected it, not in the heat of battle, not in the darkness of temptation, but in a moment of pride, a decision that would bring death to 70,000 people, a decision that would haunt David for the rest of his life. This ... is the story of David's census. The Bible gives us two perspectives on what happened next. In 2 Samuel 24, it says that God was angry with Israel, so he allowed David to make a terrible mistake. But in 1 Chronicles 21, it gives us another detail. It says that Satan himself rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census. And here's the question: what was so wrong about a census? After all, taking account of soldiers wasn't sinful. Moses had done it before, but this was different. For the first time in David's life, he wasn't trusting in God. He was trusting in numbers, in strength, in military power, and in himself. For years, David had relied on God to win his battles, but now, in his old age, something changed. He wanted to know how powerful his army was, how many men he could send into war, how much control he truly had over the kingdom. He didn't take the census to glorify God. He took it to glorify himself, and the moment he did it, he knew he had made a terrible mistake. Joab, David's ruthless but loyal general, immediately knew something was wrong. "May the Lord multiply the number of his people 100 times over," Joab protested. "But why, my king? Why do you need to do this? Why bring guilt upon Israel?" Joab was no prophet. He wasn't known for his spiritual wisdom, but even he could see it. David was stepping into dangerous territory. And yet, David ignored the warning. He ordered Joab to count every fighting man in Israel, and for 9 long months Joab traveled across the land, writing down the numbers. When he returned, the report was given: 1.3 million men. That's how many warriors David had at his command. A massive army, a powerful kingdom, and in that moment David's heart sank, because he realized that he had sinned against God. The morning after the census was complete, the prophet Gad came to David, and he brought a message that no king would ever want to hear. "This is what the Lord says. I give you 3 choices. Choose your punishment." David's blood ran cold. God was about to discipline him, but he was letting David choose how. 3 years of famine, Israel would starve. 3 months of war, David would be hunted by his enemies. 3 days of plague, a mysterious sickness would sweep through the land. What do you do when every choice leads to suffering? David collapsed before God. "I am in deep distress," he cried, "but let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands." David couldn't bear the thought of war. He had fought too many battles, and he knew that if he faced his enemies, they would show no mercy. So he chose the plague, and what happened next would shake Israel to its core. It began with a whisper, a shadow sweeping through the land, and then people began to fall. A mysterious plague swept through the streets, in every village, in every home. Families screamed in horror as their loved ones collapsed. Priests fell in the temple, soldiers dropped in the barracks, and David's heart broke as he watched 70,000 people die. His people, his sin had caused this. His pride had led to death, and as the angel of the Lord stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem itself, David could take it no more. He fell to his knees, his voice trembling with desperation. "Lord, I am the one who has sinned. I am the shepherd. These are just sheep. Punish me and my family, but do not punish them." And in that moment, God relented. The plague stopped, and the angel of the Lord stood still at the threshing floor of a man named Araunah, and it was there that David would make the greatest sacrifice of his life. David, still weeping, approached Araunah's land. "I must build an altar here," he said. "I must make a sacrifice to the Lord, so this plague will never return." Araunah, shaken by everything that had happened, offered the land for free. Take it, my king. I will give you the oxen for the sacrifice, the wood for the fire, everything you need." But David shook his head. "Number I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing." And with his own silver, David bought the land. There he built an altar. There he offered sacrifices to atone for his sin. And there the plague was stopped forever. But here's the most incredible part. That very spot, the place where God showed mercy, would one day become the most important place in Israel's history. Mount Moriah, the exact location where Solomon would build the temple of God. David had fought many battles, but his greatest battle was against his own pride. The census wasn't just about numbers, it was about trust. Would David rely on his own strength or on the God who had always fought for him? And that same question applies to us today. Do we trust in our own resources? Do we measure success by numbers, wealth, or power? Or do we put our faith in God alone? David learned this lesson the hard way, through loss, through suffering, through humility. And in the end, the man after God's own heart turned back to the Lord once again. And God showed mercy, because even when we fail, even when we fall into pride, even when we make the worst mistakes of our lives, God's mercy is always greater. David was no longer the warrior he once was. His body, once strong enough to slay giants, now trembled with age. The hands that had gripped the sword in battle, that had strummed the harp in worship, that had written some of the greatest psalms in history, now shook with weakness. The mighty king was dying, and with his last breaths he would make one final decision. Who would sit on his throne after him? Would his kingdom end in peace, or would his sons tear each other apart for the crown? This ... is the story of David's final days. David's last years were a paradox. His kingdom had never been stronger, yet his body had never been weaker. In his final battles, the once mighty warrior could no longer fight like before. One fateful day, as Israel fought the Philistines once again, David took up his sword and rode into battle. But something terrifying happened. David, the giant slayer, was suddenly overpowered. A massive Philistine warrior named Ishbi-Benob targeted the aging king, his spear weighing over 7 pounds. He lunged at David, ready to end the life of Israel's greatest king. But at the last moment, Abishai, one of David's mighty men, rushed forward and killed the Philistine. The battlefield went silent. David, breathing heavily, stood in the midst of his men, and for the first time they saw it. Their king was no longer the man he used to be. That night David's warriors came to him and begged him never to fight again. "You must not go out with us any more," they pleaded, "lest the light of Israel be extinguished." And so, after decades of battle, David put down his sword. The warrior king would fight no more. As David's health declined, a dangerous power struggle erupted. Who would be king after David? David had promised that Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, would be the next ruler. But there was a problem. David had another son. His name was Adonijah, and like his fallen brother Absalom, Adonijah was handsome, ambitious, and hungry for power. He refused to wait for David's decision. Instead, he crowned himself king while David was still alive. He gathered chariots. He assembled a group of supporters, including Joab, David's old military commander. He threw a massive royal feast, and he declared himself the next king of Israel. It was a betrayal that could have destroyed the kingdom. But what Adonijah didn't know was that someone was watching, and she would not stay silent. Bathsheba had already lost one son to death because of David's sin. She would not lose Solomon too. So she rushed to David's bedside, knowing that if she didn't act fast, Solomon would be killed. "My lord," she whispered, kneeling beside her dying husband, "did you not swear that Solomon would be king? Why then has Adonijah declared himself king while you still live?" At that moment, another figure stepped forward, Nathan the prophet. Nathan had once confronted David over his sin with Bathsheba. Now he was here again, this time to protect the kingdom. "My king Adonijah has taken your throne. If you do not act, Solomon and Bathsheba will be killed." David narrowed his eyes. Though his body was failing, his mind was still sharp. He knew what needed to be done. Summoning his last reserves of strength, David rose from his bed and made a declaration. "As surely as the Lord lives, Solomon will be king after me." And with those words, the fate of the kingdom was sealed. David called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah his trusted warrior. "Take Solomon," he commanded, "place him on my own mule, anoint him with oil, and declare him king over Israel." And so they did, as Adonijah celebrated his false victory. The sound of trumpets shook the city, and the people shouted in joy, "Long live King Solomon!" The real king had been crowned, and when Adonijah heard the noise, his face went pale. His rebellion was over before it had even begun. He rushed to the altar and begged Solomon for mercy. And Solomon spared his life for now. David was now at peace. He had fought his battles. He had built a kingdom. He had chosen his successor. And now it was time for his final words. As Solomon stood before him, David reached out one trembling hand and gave his last command, "Be strong, show yourself a man. Walk in the ways of the Lord, and you will prosper. But remember, there are men who have wronged me, Joab and Shimei. Do not let them die peacefully." Even in his final breath, David had unfinished business. He had learned through war and betrayal that a king must be both merciful and just. And then, with one last breath, David closed his eyes, and the mighty warrior, the shepherd king, the man after God's own heart, died, and Solomon took the throne. David's story is unlike any other in history. He was a warrior, a poet, a king, and a sinner. He won great battles and committed terrible sins. He was both a man of blood and a man of worship, but through it all, God never abandoned him. David's reign wasn't about perfection, it was about mercy, and that's why his throne would last forever, because from his bloodline, centuries later, would come the true King of Kings, Jesus Christ, and through him, David's kingdom would never end. David was not a perfect man. He lied, he killed, he stole another man's wife, and yet God called him a man after my own heart. How? What set David apart from every other king? And why did his throne endure forever when others were wiped from history? This ... is the story of David's true legacy. Most kings rule with power, wealth, and military strength. David had all of these, but they were not what defined him. From the moment he was a boy, David was different. Where Saul had been chosen for his appearance, his height, his armor, his strength, David was chosen for his heart. God did not look at what man sees, he looked at David's soul. When Saul disobeyed, he made excuses. When David sinned, he repented. When Saul was confronted, he blamed others. When David was confronted, he fell to his knees in sorrow. David failed many times, but he always returned to God. And that is what made him the greatest king Israel had ever known. David wasn't just a warrior or a poet. He was the king who established Israel's golden age. Before him, Israel was a scattered nation, constantly at war. But under David, Israel became a unified kingdom. He made Jerusalem the capital, the heart of the nation. He brought back the Ark of the Covenant, restoring the people's focus on God. He expanded Israel's borders farther than they had ever gone before. For the first time in history, Israel was not just surviving, it was thriving. And all of it was because David trusted God more than he trusted his own strength. David's influence wasn't just political, it was spiritual. More than half of the Psalms in the Bible were written by him. These weren't just songs, they were the cries of a man who walked with God through every season of life. When he was running for his life, he wrote, "The Lord is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." Psalm 91:2. When he was repenting of his sin, he wrote, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." Psalm 51:10. When he was rejoicing in victory, he wrote, "Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things." Psalm 98:1. His words have comforted generations. They have been sung by kings, whispered by prisoners, and cried out by those in pain. David's psalms are not just poetry. They are a record of his heart, a heart fully devoted to God. And that is why they still resonate thousands of years later. God made David a promise. "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." 2 Samuel 7:16. But how David died. His kingdom eventually fell to Babylon. His dynasty was erased from political power. So where was the fulfillment of this prophecy? It came through Jesus Christ. Centuries after David, an angel appeared to a young woman named Mary. And what did he say? "You will conceive and give birth to a son. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever." Luke 1:31-33. Jesus was called Son of David because he was the true fulfillment of God's promise. David ruled a kingdom on earth. Jesus rules a kingdom that will never end. And because of that, David's throne still stands today, not in a palace, not in a government, but in the heavens through the rule of Christ. David's story is one of triumph and failure, power and humility, sin and redemption. But above all, it is a story of God's mercy. No matter how far David fell, God never abandoned him. And that same mercy is available to all of us today. So what can we learn from David's life? God does not choose people based on appearance, status, or strength. He chooses those whose hearts are devoted to him. Repentance is more important than perfection. David sinned, but he always ran back to God. True leadership comes from humility, not power. David led with trust in God, not just military strength. God's promises never fail. Even when it seems like everything is falling apart, his plan is still in motion. David's story did not end with his death. His impact echoes through eternity, because from his line came the King of Kings. And through Jesus, David's throne will never be empty. David was a king, a warrior, a poet, but most of all, he was human. He had the highest victories and the lowest failures. He slayed giants, but was brought low by his own sin. He ruled a kingdom, but couldn't always rule his own heart. Yet even through betrayal, loss, and deep regret, one thing never changed. God never abandoned him. David's life is a mirror for us all. Leaders can learn from his humility. Dreamers can be inspired by his rise from obscurity. The broken can find hope in his restoration. His story is proof that no failure is too great for God's grace, that true greatness is not found in power, but in surrender, and that a heart that seeks God will never be forgotten. So as we close the chapter on David, we must ask ourselves, are we learning from his faith or repeating his mistakes? Will we be people who trust in our own strength or people who trust in God's mercy? David's throne was temporary, but the lessons from his life, they last forever. David's son Solomon would inherit his throne, but would he inherit his wisdom or his weakness? In the next video, we will uncover the rise and fall of Israel's wealthiest king. From building the temple to falling into idolatry, his story is one you don't want to miss. If this video blessed you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget, we've converted our most popular videos into eBooks. Check the link in the description to grab your copy and let us know in the comments if you'd like this video in ebook format. Till next time, stay blessed.